In a quiet New York town, a beloved mother was found brutally murdered in her home. At first, it looked like a break-in gone wrong. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling truth: a murder-for-hire plot masterminded by her own husband, a former hockey player hiding deadly secrets. It was a quiet night in Cadon, a small town near Elmira, New York. The kind of place where neighbors waved as they passed and doors were rarely locked. But behind one of those doors, inside the Clayton family home, a horrifying crime was about to unfold. One that would shatter a family, a community, and later become one of New York's most shocking murder-for-hire cases. Thomas Clayton, in his late 30s, was known locally as the former pro hockey player who once had promise on the ice. After retiring from minor league hockey, he had built what seemed like a stable life. He married Kelly Stage Clayton, a bright and warm woman in her early 30s, loved by everyone who knew her. The couple had 2 young children and lived what looked from the outside like an ordinary suburban dream. But inside the marriage, things were far from perfect. Thomas had always been ambitious, but his hockey career had never quite taken off the way he'd hoped. After leaving the sport, he started several small businesses, including a franchise cleaning company. Kelly worked part-time while caring for their kids, keeping up the home, and volunteering in their community. Friends often described her as full of life, kind, and fiercely dedicated to her children. To those who knew her best, she was the steady center of the family. But the same couldn't be said about her husband. People in Elmira remembered Thomas as charming but arrogant. He liked to flash signs of success: expensive cars, nights out, and poker games with friends. Financially, things were tight, but he didn't show it. Beneath the surface, tensions between Thomas and Kelly were growing. Arguments about money and his behavior were frequent. Kelly confided in friends that she was unhappy, even scared at times, but she tried to keep the family together for the children's sake. The Claytons' marriage was falling apart quietly, and no one outside the home realized how deep the cracks had become. Thomas wanted freedom from what he saw as a suffocating life. He didn't want a divorce that would divide his property and cost him custody of his children. The thought of paying alimony and child support frustrated him. He wanted control, not compromise. It was that desire for control and for money that led him down a path from which there was no return. Around this time, Thomas reconnected with Michael Beard, a man in his late 40s who had once worked for him. Beard had been an employee at Thomas's cleaning business but was later fired. He was struggling financially, looking for quick cash, and living in a rough patch of town. Thomas saw in him someone desperate enough to do anything for money. What started as a conversation between 2 men about work soon turned into a deadly agreement. Investigators later learned that Thomas promised Michael Beard $10,000 to kill Kelly. It wasn't an impulsive act of rage. It was a calculated plan. Thomas wanted it to look like a burglary gone wrong. Beard agreed, seeing it as a way to fix his own financial troubles. The plan was simple. Thomas would make sure he was seen at a poker game that night, giving himself an alibi, while Beard would go to the house and carry out the murder. On the night of September 28, 2015, Thomas left home for a regular poker game with friends. He joked, drank, and played cards as if it were any other night. At home, Kelly put her children to bed, unaware that her life was about to end. Later that night, Michael Beard arrived at the Clayton house. Using a spare key Thomas had provided, he entered quietly. There was no forced entry. Kelly may have heard a noise or sensed something wrong, but before she could react, Beard attacked her. She was brutally beaten with a metal object in the bedroom, an act so violent that detectives would later call the scene one of the most disturbing they had ever witnessed. Beard left the house as planned, and Thomas returned home later that night, pretending everything was normal. The next morning, the family's young daughter found her mother dead and ran screaming for help. The image of that child crying in the street would stay with the community forever. When police arrived, Thomas acted shocked and heartbroken. He told them he had been at a poker game all night and found out about the murder only when he got home. At first, investigators treated him as a grieving husband, but their instincts told them something was off. Detectives quickly noticed that nothing had been stolen. There were no signs of a break-in, no forced locks, and no valuable items missing. The scene didn't fit a random burglary. Thomas's calm, almost rehearsed behavior also drew suspicion. He seemed more focused on appearances than on his wife's death. Friends who came to comfort him noticed he wasn't breaking down the way they expected. The contrast between his flat reaction and the horror of what had happened stood out. Within days, investigators began digging into Thomas's life. They found out about the couple's strained relationship, the arguments, and Kelly's recent talk about separation. They also discovered his financial troubles. Money was tight, and Thomas had life insurance policies that could benefit him if Kelly died. The picture of a devoted husband quickly began to fade. Meanwhile, police examined surveillance footage from around the area. They found something that would change the course of the investigation. A vehicle matching Michael Beard's car had been spotted near the Clayton home the night of the murder. When detectives traced the vehicle and brought Beard in for questioning, he initially denied everything. But after hours of interrogation, his story began to crack. Beard confessed that he had been at the Clayton home the night of the murder. He claimed Thomas hired him to kill Kelly and make it look like a robbery. He said Thomas had given him the key and promised to pay once the job was done. This confession shocked investigators, but confirmed what they already suspected, that this wasn't a random act of violence, but a carefully planned crime driven by greed and resentment. Even with Beard's confession, police needed more. They went through phone records, texts, and bank statements. They found communications between Thomas and Beard leading up to the murder, along with suspicious withdrawals that matched the payment Beard expected. The case was coming together piece by piece, but they wanted to be certain before making an arrest. As days passed, the community of Elmira tried to make sense of what had happened. Friends of Kelly were devastated. They remembered her as a loving mother who adored her children, someone who didn't deserve such cruelty. Her death left not only grief, but also confusion. How could the man she built a life with be involved in something so evil? Behind the scenes, investigators continued to build their case quietly. They were connecting evidence, checking alibis, and following the digital trail that would soon bring everything into focus. Thomas Clayton, still trying to act the part of the mourning husband, had no idea how close the police were to uncovering the truth. What began as a tragic murder soon revealed itself to be a deliberate act of betrayal, fueled by money, control, and resentment. The walls were closing in on Thomas Clayton, and the story that had started as a small-town tragedy was about to become a full-blown criminal investigation that gripped the nation. The morning after Kelly Clayton's murder, the quiet town of Cadone was flooded with police cars, investigators, and reporters. The crime scene at the Clayton's house looked more like something from a crime show than a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Inside, detectives carefully moved through the house, documenting every detail. Blood patterns, broken glass, and signs of a violent struggle told a story of terror. But what was missing, forced entry, missing valuables, told an even louder story. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far more personal. Detectives started piecing together a timeline. Thomas Clayton had called 911 just after arriving home from his poker game around midnight, claiming he found his wife dead. His voice on the call sounded controlled, almost too calm. He told dispatchers that Kelly wasn't moving, that there was blood everywhere, and that he didn't know what had happened. When officers arrived, they noticed something strange. Thomas wasn't acting like a man who had just found his wife brutally murdered. He wasn't panicked or disoriented. He was steady, even composed, as if trying to manage the situation rather than react to it. Detective Mike Cobb from the Chemung County Sheriff's Office later said that his gut told him something wasn't right. Thomas seemed detached, and his version of events felt rehearsed. Still, there was no hard evidence tying him to the crime. Yet, the investigators had to move carefully. They collected fingerprints, shoe prints, and swabs of DNA. They canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. Some neighbors recalled seeing a strange car parked not far from the Clayton house that night, a dark-colored vehicle that didn't belong there. That detail would soon become critical. As word of the murder spread, people in Elmira and Cadone were in disbelief. Kelly was known and loved by many. She had grown up in the area, attended local schools, and had many friends. Her death didn't just shock the community, it devastated it. Vigils were held, flowers were placed outside the family home, and people spoke of Kelly's warmth, her laughter, and her devotion to her children. Everyone wanted to know who could do something so cruel. In the days that followed, detectives focused their attention on Thomas's alibi. He said he had been at a poker game at his friend's house in Elmira that night, playing cards with a small group of men until late. Investigators interviewed every person who had been there. The story checked out at first. Thomas had been seen at the game, relaxed, laughing, even joking. He'd left around 11:30 p.m. and arrived home shortly after midnight. On the surface, it looked like a solid alibi. But the timing was tight, and the distance between Elmira and Cotton left just enough room for doubt. While detectives analyzed his movements, they also dug deeper into Thomas and Kelly's relationship. Friends told police that things had been bad for months. Kelly had told close friends that she wanted to separate, maybe even file for divorce. She had also confided that Thomas could be controlling, and that she felt trapped. Financial issues had made things worse. Thomas's cleaning franchise wasn't doing as well as he let on. They were struggling to keep up appearances. For investigators, the combination of financial pressure, marital problems, and a lack of emotion after the murder made Thomas a prime suspect. The investigation gained momentum when detectives followed up on a lead about that dark vehicle seen near the house. A security camera from a nearby business caught a car matching the description driving toward the Claytons' neighborhood around the time of the murder. The plate number led police to Michael Beard, a former employee of Thomas Clayton. Beard lived in Elmira and had a record of minor offenses, mostly related to theft. He was brought in for questioning. At first, Beard denied knowing anything about the murder. He claimed he hadn't seen Thomas in a while and had no reason to go near the Clayton home. But detectives already had cell phone data showing that Beard's phone had pinged near the Claytons' house that night. The evidence was tightening around him. After hours of questioning, Beard's story began to crumble. He finally broke down and confessed, saying Thomas Clayton had hired him to kill his wife for money. He explained that Thomas wanted out of the marriage, but didn't want to lose his home or half his assets. The plan, Beard said, was to make it look like a burglary that turned violent. Beard's confession was explosive, but investigators needed to verify every detail before moving forward. They asked Beard to describe how it happened. He said Thomas gave him a key to the house, told him Kelly would be home alone, and promised to pay him $10,000 after the job. He described the layout of the home accurately and told detectives where he had entered and how he had attacked Kelly. Every detail matched what investigators had found at the scene. There was no forced entry. The evidence supported his story. Still, detectives knew Beard had his own reasons to lie or exaggerate, so they went after corroborating proof. Phone records confirmed contact between Thomas and Beard before and after the murder. Surveillance cameras showed Beard's car driving on the route that led to the Claytons' home that night. Bank records hinted at unexplained cash withdrawals by Thomas. It was becoming clear that this was not the work of a stranger or a random crime. It was an orchestrated killing for profit and convenience. Despite the mounting evidence, Thomas continued to maintain his innocence. He cooperated with police publicly, even attended Kelly's memorial service, crying in front of cameras. But behind that show of grief, detectives could sense calculation. The moment the police had Beard's confession, the tone of the investigation shifted. They were no longer looking for a mystery killer. They were building a case to prove a murder-for-hire plot. Investigators also started to piece together how Thomas and Beard had rekindled contact. Beard had been fired from Thomas's cleaning business months earlier after a dispute. But Thomas had recently reached out, offering him work. Beard, struggling with unemployment and desperate for money, agreed to meet. That meeting wasn't about cleaning jobs. It was about planning a murder. According to Beard's account, Thomas first tested him with smaller requests before finally bringing up the plan to kill Kelly. He told Beard he wanted it to look like a burglary gone wrong, and Beard, seeing the opportunity for cash, said yes. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued examining the crime scene. They found Beard's DNA in several places, including the entryway. His shoe prints matched patterns left in blood near the bedroom. The evidence made it impossible for him to deny being there. But now that Beard had implicated Thomas, police wanted direct proof that Thomas was involved. They needed something more solid than the word of a confessed killer. The investigation turned to Thomas's digital footprint. Detectives subpoenaed his phone records, bank statements, and GPS data. They found calls made to Beard's number before and after the murder. They also found that Thomas's phone had been turned off for a suspicious period that night, between the end of the poker game and his return home. It looked like he was deliberately avoiding tracking during the window of the crime. To detectives, it was the missing piece. They could now show communication, planning, and motive. As police prepared to arrest both men, they kept a tight lid on the case. They didn't want Thomas to know they had turned Beard. But small-town rumors spread fast, and word got out that someone was talking. Thomas began acting nervous. He tried to reach Beard several times, leaving messages that sounded concerned but vague. Investigators were already listening. When the arrests came, the town was stunned. Thomas Clayton, the once popular athlete, was charged with murder and conspiracy. Michael Beard was charged with first-degree murder. The news hit local headlines immediately. To many, it felt unthinkable that a husband could pay someone to kill his wife, the mother of his children. But the evidence spoke for itself. As both men sat in jail awaiting trial, the public started hearing more details about what had really happened behind the doors of the Clayton home. It wasn't a single moment of anger. It was a plan that took shape over weeks, maybe months. Thomas had calculated every move, believing he could outsmart everyone. He wanted to appear as the grieving husband while quietly collecting on insurance money and starting a new life. But he underestimated how quickly truth can unravel. The case was now national news. Major outlets like ESPN and Dateline cover it, focusing on the shocking fall of a former athlete turned murderer. Friends of Kelly spoke out, calling her the true victim, not just of violence, but of betrayal. Detectives continued gathering everything they could, determined to make sure justice was airtight when the case went to trial. By the end of that year, the story had transformed from a local tragedy into a courtroom drama waiting to happen. The prosecution had motive, confession, and hard evidence. The defense, meanwhile, was preparing to argue that Beard had acted alone. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Kelly Clayton's murder had exposed the darkest side of a man who once seemed to have it all, and in the process, it tore apart an entire community. The trial of Thomas Clayton was one of the most closely watched cases in upstate New York. The courtroom in Chemung County was packed every day with journalists, townspeople, and friends of Kelly who wanted to see justice done. By the time the trial began, the story had become a national headline. A former pro hockey player accused of hiring a hitman to murder his wife. It was the kind of case that combined small-town drama, betrayal, and cold calculation, all under the glare of national attention. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They described Thomas Clayton as a man driven by greed, resentment, and a need for control. They said he had grown tired of his marriage and wanted freedom without paying the price of divorce. He wanted his wife gone, but his lifestyle intact. The state's attorney walked the jury through the chain of evidence, phone records, financial transactions, and most damning of all, the confession of Michael Beard. Every piece connected Thomas to the murder-for-hire plot. Prosecutors told the jury that Thomas had orchestrated everything, right down to setting up his own alibi at the poker game while his wife was being beaten to death. Michael Beard's testimony was the centerpiece of the trial. He appeared in court wearing a prison jumpsuit, his eyes downcast. When he took the stand, the room fell silent. Beard told the jury how Thomas approached him weeks before the murder, offering him money to kill Kelly and make it look like a robbery. He described how Thomas gave him a house key, directions, and a promise of payment. His words painted a chilling picture of manipulation and greed. But the defense attacked Beard's credibility, arguing that he was a liar trying to save himself by blaming someone else. They said he alone was responsible for Kelly's death and that Thomas had nothing to do with it. Still, the physical evidence supported Beard's story. Cell phone records showed multiple calls and messages between him and Thomas before the killing. Security footage placed Beard's car near the crime scene at the exact time of the murder. Bank withdrawals from Thomas's account lined up with the timeline of when Beard said he expected payment. And then there was Thomas's behavior after the crime, his calm demeanor, his lack of emotion, and his quick effort to project innocence. Jurors could see through it. Prosecutors emphasized that no valuables were missing, no doors were forced open, and the only person who benefited from Kelly's death was her husband. The defense team tried to argue that Thomas was being framed. They said Beard acted on his own, possibly out of anger after being fired. They suggested that Beard knew details about the house from his previous job and had broken in on his own. They painted Thomas as an unfortunate husband caught in a web of lies spun by a desperate man. But that theory didn't hold up against the sheer weight of evidence. Every phone record, every witness, and every forensic report pointed back to Thomas. As the trial went on, more details about the Claytons' marriage came out. Friends testified that Kelly had talked about leaving Thomas. One friend said Kelly was scared of him and believed he might hurt her if she tried to end the relationship. Others described Thomas as controlling and temperamental. The image of a loving husband completely collapsed. Instead, what emerged was the portrait of a man who valued money and image over human life. The prosecution also revealed how calculated Thomas's plan was. He didn't just want his wife dead. He wanted to appear blameless. That's why he made sure to attend the poker game that night. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he kept checking his phone throughout the game, leaving the table several times to take short calls. Investigators later confirmed that those calls matched Beard's phone activity during the same hours. It was proof of coordination, even during the crime itself. When it came time for closing arguments, the prosecution reminded the jury that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was business to Thomas Clayton. He wanted to erase his wife the way someone might erase a debt. They described Kelly's final moments, the brutality of the attack, and the innocence of the children who found their mother lifeless. The courtroom was silent as they showed photos of the scene and replayed Thomas's 911 call. The contrast between the horror of the crime and his steady voice was chilling. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with their verdict. Thomas Clayton was found guilty of first-degree and second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in quiet emotion, tears from Kelly's family, relief from investigators, and disbelief from Thomas, who stood motionless as the verdict was read. For many who had followed the case from the beginning, it was a moment of justice long overdue. At sentencing, the judge called the crime an act of pure selfishness and cruelty. He told Thomas that his actions had destroyed not only his wife's life, but also the lives of his children, who would now grow up without either parent. Thomas Clayton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed little reaction, just a blank stare as the words were spoken. His former accomplice, Michael Beard, had already received the same sentence in a separate trial. Both men would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. For Kelly's family and friends, the verdict was justice, but not healing. They had lost a daughter, a friend, and a mother to 2 small children. At her memorial, people spoke of her kindness, her energy, and her love for life. She had been a devoted mother who worked hard to keep her family together, even when things were falling apart behind closed doors. Her death was more than a murder. It was a betrayal from the person she trusted most. As the story spread across the country, people were struck by the coldness of Thomas's actions. He had once been admired as a local sports figure, someone who had achieved what others only dreamed of. But in the end, his legacy became a cautionary tale about greed, arrogance, and moral collapse. The image of the ex-hockey player in handcuffs replaced any memory of him on the ice. In the years since the conviction, the community has tried to move forward, but the memory of that night in 2015 still lingers. The Clayton children were placed with family members who have worked to give them as normal a life as possible. friends continue to honor Kelly's memory through local events and charities focused on domestic violence awareness. Her name became a symbol of resilience and a reminder of how easily appearances can hide danger. The turning point in the case, the confession from Michael Beard, remains one of the most shocking moments in the investigation. Without it, Thomas might have continued to live freely, pretending to be a grieving husband. But Beard's words, backed by evidence, stripped away that mask. They revealed the truth about what really happened inside that quiet home in Cotton. It wasn't just a murder, it was a meticulously planned betrayal. Looking back, investigators often say it was the small details that brought Thomas down. The phone records, the cash withdrawals, the calm demeanor, and his need to appear in control. Each piece seemed insignificant on its own, but together they told a story of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone. He couldn't. The truth eventually caught up with him, and justice did too. Today, the story of Thomas and Kelly Clayton stands as a grim example of how ordinary lives can hide extraordinary darkness. It's a story about greed disguised as love and control disguised as strength. It's about a woman who wanted to protect her children and a man who chose to destroy everything for his own comfort. And while the legal chapter of the case is closed, the emotional scars it left on the community remain. In the end, the tragedy of Kelly Clayton is remembered not for the cruelty that ended her life, but for the light she brought to those who knew her. Her friends continue to say that her laughter filled every room she entered. That's how they choose to remember her, not as a victim, but as a person whose story reminds others to see the warning signs, to speak out, and to never underestimate the power of truth. For the people of Elmira and Cotton, justice came, but peace took longer. What began as a night of horror became a lesson about deception, trust, and how evil can hide behind even the most familiar smile. In a quiet college town in upstate New York, a young woman's laughter vanished overnight. What began as an ordinary Friday turned into a nightmare that shocked a campus and shattered two families. Behind one dorm room door, love twisted into violence, and the truth would leave everyone asking, why? It began as a normal autumn weekend in upstate New York. The small college town of Brockport, just west of Rochester, was settling into the calm rhythm of a Friday night. Students at the college at Brockport, State University of New York, were out laughing, studying, or heading to parties. Among them was 18-year-old freshman Alexandra Kogut, a swimmer and communications major from New Hartford, New York. Friends called her Alex. She was bright, kind, and ambitious, known for her energy in the pool and her easy smile on campus. She had been at Brockport only a few weeks, but already seemed to fit right in. That evening, Alex was waiting for her boyfriend, Clayton Whitmore, to arrive. Clayton, 21, was also from New Hartford. He was a student at Utica College, where he played on the men's ice hockey team. They had been dating since high school, a relationship that looked perfect from the outside. Two athletes, young and full of plans. But people who knew them said there were cracks beneath the surface. Arguments had become more frequent, often sparked by jealousy or misunderstandings. Still, Alex believed in him. To her friends, she spoke about his good side, saying he could be caring and protective. That night, Clayton drove the roughly 2-hour trip from Utica to Brockport to see her. The drive along the thruway was long and quiet, giving him plenty of time to think. By the time he reached the campus, the sun had already gone down. He parked near Lakeside Hall, Alex's dorm building, and walked in with the confidence of someone who had been there before. Security was light, as it often was in small college towns. Inside the dorm, everything appeared ordinary. Students passed by in the hallway, some nodding hello. No one could have guessed what was about to unfold behind one of those closed doors. Alex welcomed him into her room, room 108. For a while, everything seemed fine. They talked, maybe laughed a little, like countless other couples that night. But then, as it had before, a small disagreement began to grow. The exact words exchanged would never be fully known, but it was clear from later testimony that the argument escalated quickly. Clayton was known by teammates as confident and competitive, sometimes to the point of intensity. On the ice, That drive made him a strong player. Off the ice, it could turn into something darker when emotions ran high. What started as a simple disagreement soon became heated. Alex, tired of the constant tension, tried to calm things down. She asked him to leave. But instead of walking out, his anger took over. The fight that followed was brutal. Inside the dorm room's four walls, Clayton began striking Alex. The first hit may have been in the heat of the moment, but what happened next showed complete loss of control. He hit her again and again. Neighbors in nearby rooms would later say they heard loud thumping noises, but no one realized what it was. Some thought it was music or people fooling around. Minutes passed. The violence didn't stop. When it was over, Alex Kogut lay motionless on the floor. The room was a mess, evidence of a struggle, of rage that had gone far beyond reason. Clayton stood over her, realizing what he had done. She was just 18 years old, a freshman who had come to Brockport with dreams of college life, swimming, and a future in broadcasting. For a moment, the world must have gone silent for him. The adrenaline faded, replaced by shock. He didn't call for help. He didn't try to save her. Instead, he grabbed his things and left the dorm room. The quiet of the hallway contrasted with what had just happened inside. Cameras later captured him leaving the building in the early hours of the morning. Outside, the campus was still. The cool air of late September filled the night. Clayton got into his car and began driving. His mind was racing. Somewhere along the highway, the reality of his actions began to set in. He had killed the girl he claimed to love. The drive east toward his hometown stretched out endlessly, mile after mile of guilt and panic. As he headed down the New York State Thruway, he made a phone call to his father. In a broken voice, he told him something terrible had happened. "I hurt her," he said. His father, alarmed, pressed for details. When Clayton admitted what he'd done, his father told him to stop driving and wait for the police. Around that time, state troopers were already being alerted. Authorities in Brockport had discovered Alex's body after her mother, concerned that her daughter hadn't answered messages, called campus police to check on her. When officers entered the dorm room, the scene told the story without words. By the time police located Clayton, he had pulled over at a rest stop near Syracuse. It was early morning, still dark outside. Officers approached his vehicle carefully. He didn't resist. He stepped out quietly, his hands shaking. When they asked what happened, he didn't deny it. He said he had gotten angry, that they fought, and that he snapped. It was a chilling word, one that would echo through the courtroom years later. News of Alex's death spread through Brockport within hours. The small college community was in disbelief. Students who had seen her earlier that week couldn't comprehend it. Professors spoke of her enthusiasm and focus, her habit of sitting in the front row and asking thoughtful questions. The swim team canceled its weekend practice, gathering instead to cry and comfort one another. Back in New Hartford, where both Alex and Clayton were from, the shock was even deeper. These were two young people from the same area, families who knew each other, neighbors who now struggled to process the unimaginable. For Alexandra's parents, the phone call that came that morning shattered everything. Their daughter, their only child, was gone. At the college at Brockport, a candlelight vigil formed that evening outside Lakeside Hall. Hundreds of students stood together, some holding photos of Alex, others simply holding candles in silence. Tears fell freely as friends shared memories, her laugh, her determination, her kindness. The school's president spoke briefly, urging everyone to remember her spirit and to look out for one another. Meanwhile, Clayton sat in custody. He was charged with second-degree murder. Detectives interviewed him for hours. His tone was flat, his answers short. He told them he hadn't planned it, but admitted that he had intentionally beaten her during their argument. That distinction between planning and intent would later become central in court. As the investigation continued, details about their relationship emerged. Friends described a bond that had started sweet but had become complicated. Alex had confided to some that they argued too much, that Clayton could be controlling at times. Others said he seemed frustrated by her new college life, worried about losing her as she met new people. None of them thought it could end this way. Over the next few days, the media covered every angle. The story of a promising freshman killed by her boyfriend spread quickly across New York and beyond. Photos of Alex, smiling in her swim cap, posing with friends, appeared on every news site. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, waiting for updates. Inside the courtroom for his first appearance, Clayton looked exhausted. His once athletic frame seemed smaller under the weight of what he'd done. He kept his eyes down as the judge read the charges. Reporters noted that he barely spoke. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for a long legal process. Back on campus, counselors met with students who were struggling to process the loss. Dorm staff reviewed safety protocols. Parents called their children, shaken by the thought that something like this could happen in what seemed a safe college town. The conversation about relationship violence began to grow louder, fueled by grief and anger. Alexandra Kogut had come to Brockport to start a new chapter, to make friends, swim competitively, and study communication. She wanted to work in media, maybe as a reporter. Her teachers described her as confident yet humble, someone who lit up a room. Those dreams ended in a moment of senseless rage. As the days passed, a question hung heavy in the air. Why? Why would a young man with a future in front of him do something so horrific to someone he claimed to love? There were no clear answers, only fragments of explanations: anger, jealousy, loss of control. The case of Clayton Whitmore and Alexandra Kogut was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a story about youth, violence, and the thin line between affection and aggression. For now, though, it remained a haunting silence in a dorm room in Brockport, a place that once held laughter, now marked by a crime that would never be forgotten. The days following Alexandra Kogut's death were filled with grief, confusion, and disbelief. The college at Brockport campus moved under a cloud of sadness. Lakeside Hall, once just another dorm, became a place students walked past quietly, avoiding eye contact. Police tape had been removed, but the sense of loss lingered. For the people who knew Alex, the thought that she had died in her own room, a space meant for safety and comfort, was almost too much to comprehend. Investigators began piecing together the events of that night. They talked to neighbors who lived in rooms nearby, reviewed camera footage, and traced Clayton Whitmore's movements. From the moment he arrived at the dorm to when he left, the timeline grew clear. Around midnight, students recalled hearing noises, thuds, perhaps muffled yelling, but dismissed it as late-night commotion. One student even mentioned hearing something that sounded like furniture being moved, but no one called for help. No one could have known that, behind those walls, a young woman was being beaten to death. At the same time, detectives at the New York State Police Barracks were questioning Clayton. He had been taken into custody at a thruway rest stop near Syracuse early the next morning. Officers said he looked calm, almost too calm for what he had done. His clothes were stained, his hands bruised. When they asked about Alexandra, he admitted right away that he had hurt her. Then, in the next breath, he said he had killed her. That confession came with little emotion, just words, as if he was describing something that had already happened to someone else. The interrogation lasted for hours. Clayton explained that they had started arguing about small things that night, the kind of fight they'd had before. He said she told him he was too controlling, that she wanted space. He claimed she said something that made him angry, something he refused to repeat. In his version, he snapped. That word would come up again and again. Snapped. He told the detectives that after the first hit, he couldn't stop himself. He said he didn't use a weapon. His fists were enough. Then, after realizing what he'd done, he panicked and left. For investigators, the confession was straightforward. They had a suspect, a motive rooted in anger, and a detailed account of the night. But for the Kogut family, the reality was unbearable. Their daughter, who had just started college, was gone in an instant. Her mother, Sarah Kogut, had been the one to call campus police that night after Alexandra stopped responding to her messages. She had no idea that the silence she worried about was permanent. When officers found Alexandra, she was already dead. In New Hartford, both families lived just a few miles apart. Clayton's parents had known Alexandra well. They had watched the two teenagers grow close, then distant, then close again. The news hit them with a kind of horror that couldn't be spoken. Their son had taken another family's child. It was the kind of story that turned a quiet town into a place haunted by whispers. The media descended quickly. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, outside both families' homes, and even around the college. Every photo of Alexandra, smiling with friends, holding swimming medals, became part of the story. Every detail about Clayton, his hockey stats, his time at Utica College, was examined. The contrast between the two young athletes made the story even more tragic. Two promising lives, one destroyed and one ruined. Back on campus, Alexandra's friends tried to hold on to good memories. They spoke about how she laughed easily, how she helped others, how she was always the first to volunteer for anything. Some friends said they had seen signs of tension between her and Clayton before, but they never imagined he was capable of violence. One recalled a night when Alex had cried after an argument with him, but brushed it off the next day, saying he'd just been in a bad mood. Others noticed how he checked her phone or grew jealous when she talked to other people. Police collected every piece of evidence they could find. They searched the dorm room, photographed the scene, and cataloged the damage. It told the story of rage, broken objects, blood patterns, the signs of a violent struggle. There was no question about what had happened or who had done it. The only question left was why it had gone so far. At his arraignment, Clayton appeared in court wearing handcuffs and a jail uniform. The judge read the charge, second-degree murder. His lawyer entered a plea of not guilty, though everyone in the courtroom knew he had confessed. The plea was procedural, meant to give time to build a defense. Reporters filled the back rows, and flashes from cameras lit the room as he was led away. In the following weeks, investigators continued to gather details about his behavior before the murder. They spoke to teammates at Utica College, who described him as intense, sometimes moody, but not violent. They said he had seemed distracted lately, worried about his relationship with Alexandra. One teammate mentioned that Clayton had said she might break up with him. That thought seemed to bother him more than anything else. Meanwhile, Alexandra's funeral drew hundreds of people. The church in New Hartford overflowed with mourners, friends, classmates, teachers, neighbors. Her swimming teammates from Brockport attended wearing their team jackets. The service was filled with memories of her kindness and drive, the girl who worked hard at everything she did and wanted to make people proud. There were no words strong enough for the loss her parents felt. They sat in silence, their faces pale and hollow. In Utica, where Clayton was being held at the county jail, he spent his days in isolation. Guards described him as quiet, polite even. He didn't cause trouble, didn't talk much. At one point, a reporter asked if he felt remorse. His lawyer refused to let him answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The community wanted an explanation, some sign that he understood what he had done, but there was none. The story drew attention to a larger issue: relationship violence among young people. News anchors and social workers spoke about warning signs, control, and anger management. It was a topic many had ignored until Alexandra's death forced it into the open. Schools across New York began holding discussions on dating violence, urging students to seek help if they felt unsafe or trapped. Months passed, and the case moved slowly through the legal system. Each hearing brought Alex's parents back into court, forced to sit just feet from the man who had killed their daughter. They never spoke to him, never looked directly at him. The pain was too deep. For them, each day was a reminder of what was taken, the college graduation that would never happen, the life their daughter never got to live. As for Clayton, he spent those months under heavy scrutiny. His legal team explored defenses that might lessen the charge: temporary insanity, emotional distress, but nothing erased the fact that he had admitted to the killing. Prosecutors prepared a case centered on intent, determined to prove that it wasn't a momentary loss of control, but a deliberate act of violence. By the time the trial date approached, the story had reached national headlines. It was no longer just about one couple. It had become a warning about how quickly love can turn into something deadly. Both families stayed mostly out of the public eye, their grief unfolding in private. The trial would bring everything back into the open. Evidence, photos, and Clayton's own confession would be laid out for the court to hear. The details would be painful, but they were necessary for justice. And as everyone waited for that day, one truth remained clear. Nothing could bring Alexandra back. When the trial of Clayton Whitmore finally began, more than a year had passed since Alexandra Koget's death. The courtroom in Monroe County was full. Journalists, students, and local residents all gathered to hear how the story would end. At the front sat Alex's parents, Sarah and William Koget, their faces pale but determined. Across the room, Clayton's family sat silently, aware that nothing they could say would change what had happened. Clayton entered the courtroom dressed neatly in a dark suit, his hair trimmed, his expression blank. The confident college athlete he once was had vanished. When the judge called the case, a hush fell over the room. He faced one count of second-degree murder, a charge that carried a possible sentence of 25 years to life in prison. The prosecution opened by describing the night of September 28, 2012, in plain and painful detail. They showed photos of Alexandra's dorm room, evidence of the violence she endured. They described her as a bright young woman who had trusted someone who was supposed to care for her. The prosecutor said this was not a sudden accident, but a beating that went on for several minutes, long enough for Clayton to know what he was doing. Witnesses were called to recount the hours before the crime. Friends of Alexandra testified that she had been in good spirits that day, excited for the weekend. Neighbors from Lakeside Hall recalled faint noises during the night, but never imagined they were hearing a murder. Police investigators walked the court through their discovery of the scene, their interviews, and the moment Clayton confessed. The defense, in contrast, tried to portray Clayton as a young man who lost control. His lawyer argued that he had no history of violence, that he was under emotional stress, and that he didn't plan to kill Alexandra. They said he was overwhelmed by anger and acted impulsively. But the prosecution countered that Clayton had used the word intentionally during his confession, telling police he meant to kill her. That single word erased any hope of convincing the court it was an accident. Throughout the testimony, Clayton remained still. He listened, occasionally glanced down, but rarely looked at the people in front of him. When the prosecution played the recording of his police interview, the room grew silent. His voice filled the speakers, calm, almost detached, as he described how the argument started and how he hit her. He told officers that once he began, he couldn't stop. The prosecutor paused the recording and let the silence sink in before moving on. The emotional weight in the courtroom grew heavier when Alexandra's mother took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described the moment she realized something was wrong. The unanswered messages, the call to campus police, the knock on her door hours later. She spoke about her daughter's life, her goals, and the last time she saw her alive. There were no outbursts, no anger, just quiet heartbreak that filled every corner of the room. After several days of testimony, the evidence left little room for doubt. Clayton Whitmore had killed Alexandra Koget with his bare hands during an argument in her dorm room. There was no question of who did it or how. The only thing left was accountability. Before the verdict, Clayton's defense team met privately with prosecutors. Facing the strength of the evidence, he chose to plead guilty to second-degree murder. He told the court he wanted to take responsibility for what he had done. When he stood before the judge to be sentenced, he finally spoke in his own words. His voice was low, his hands trembling. He said he wished he could take it back, that he never meant for things to go that far. He apologized to the Koget family, though they didn't look at him. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of his voice and the faint sobs from the gallery. The judge's response was brief and firm. He called the crime vicious and said no amount of regret could undo the suffering caused. He sentenced Clayton Whitmore to 25 years to life in prison, the maximum penalty allowed for second-degree murder. As he was let out in handcuffs, his parents wept quietly. On the other side, Alexandra's family held each other, finally hearing the words they had waited 2 years to hear. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to capture reactions. Sarah Koget spoke briefly, thanking the community for their support, but saying nothing could bring her daughter back. She described Alexandra as a light that could not be replaced. The case had ended, but for her and her husband, life would never return to normal. In the months that followed, the college at Brockport held memorial events in Alexandra's name. Scholarships were created in her honor, supporting young students who embodied her spirit, determined, kind, and full of life. Her friends often visited the campus pool where she used to swim, leaving flowers or notes by the bleachers. Clayton began serving his sentence in a state correctional facility. His hockey career, his education, his future, all gone. In interviews years later, he expressed regret, saying he didn't understand how anger could destroy everything in a single moment. But to many, those words offered little comfort. The story of Alexandra Kogut and Clayton Whitmore became a lasting reminder of how love can turn dangerous when anger and control take hold. It led to new conversations about dating violence on college campuses, prompting schools to strengthen awareness programs and support systems for students in toxic relationships. For those who knew Alexandra, the memory of her laughter, her dedication, and her warmth remained stronger than the tragedy. Her life was short, but the impact of her story reached far beyond Brockport. It became a warning, a lesson, and above all, a call to recognize the signs of violence before it's too late. In the calm suburbs of Espoo, Finland, a love story between a young hockey star and an older veterinarian spiraled into tragedy. When 29-year-old Jana Pahakka returned to settle unfinished matters, no one imagined it would end in gunfire. What really happened inside that quiet house on that October morning? It was a quiet October morning in Espoo, Finland, a peaceful city just west of Helsinki, known for its lakes, modern architecture, and calm suburban rhythm. But behind the stillness of that autumn day, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shock the nation. It was the story of two men whose lives had once intertwined through affection and companionship, but ended in heartbreak and violence. Jana Pahakka was only 29 years old, a former professional ice hockey player. He had lived a life that many young athletes dreamed of. Born in Kuopio, Finland, Jana had shown promise from a young age. He was fast, confident on the ice, and deeply focused. Over the years, he played for several Finnish clubs and even spent time in the Swiss and Norwegian leagues. But beyond his athletic ability, Jana carried a quiet courage that earned him national attention. He was one of the first openly gay professional hockey players in Finland. His openness about his sexuality made him both admired and scrutinized. He had spoken publicly about the challenges of being gay in a sport that often prized toughness and silence over vulnerability. He became, unintentionally, a symbol of honesty in a world that often hid behind helmets and ice. Outside of hockey, Jana was known as kind, charming, and grounded. He loved travel, nature, and photography. His social media often showed glimpses of simple joys, coffee cups by lakesides, teammates laughing, quiet walks in the woods. But like anyone else, Jana's personal life had its complications. Around 2020, he met Rolf Nordmo, a man nearly 4 decades older than him. Rolf was 66, a respected veterinarian of Norwegian origin who had lived in Finland for many years. He was calm, intelligent, and meticulous, known for his devotion to his profession and love for animals. Friends described him as polite and reserved, the kind of man who spoke thoughtfully and moved deliberately. Despite the age difference, the two formed a relationship. At first, it seemed genuine and affectionate. They shared a home in Espoo, where they lived together for a couple of years. Those close to Jana said he seemed content, even peaceful. Rolf was financially secure, stable, and attentive, someone who provided a sense of calm after the demanding years of Jana's professional career. But beneath the surface, small cracks began to show. As time went on, the differences in their personalities and expectations became hard to ignore. Jana was young, outgoing, and ready to explore a new chapter in life outside professional sports. Rolf, much older and more settled, was possessive in quiet ways. Friends noticed that Jana had begun to withdraw slightly. There were subtle signs of strain, less enthusiasm in photos, shorter visits with friends, and a tone of restlessness in his messages. It wasn't a dramatic split, at least not at first. But by late summer of 2024, their relationship had reached a breaking point. According to reports, Yana decided to end things and move out. He wanted to start over, live on his own, and take time to focus on his future. He left the shared home in Espoo, finding a new place nearby. The decision wasn't sudden. It came after long talks, attempts to reconcile, and quiet realizations that their paths were no longer the same. For Rolf, however, the separation was painful. He had invested deeply, emotionally and financially, in the relationship. To him, Jana's departure was not just a breakup. It was a rejection of everything he had built in his later years. In the weeks that followed, communication between them continued, but it was strained. There were practical matters to resolve: shared property, personal belongings, and finances. Despite the emotional distance, they agreed to meet occasionally to sort these things out. Friends of Jana said he approached it calmly, trying to keep things civil. But Rolf, they believed, was struggling to let go. His tone, once gentle, had grown tense and unpredictable. On October 13, 2024, Jana returned to the Espoo house to finalize a few remaining issues. It was supposed to be a short visit. Neighbors later recalled seeing him arrive that morning, appearing relaxed but focused. He had parked his car outside and walked in, likely expecting another routine conversation. What happened next would change everything. Inside the house, the conversation reportedly began normally but soon escalated. Police later pieced together the sequence of events through evidence and testimony. The two men argued, perhaps about personal belongings or perhaps about their failed relationship. The atmosphere turned tense. For reasons that remain unclear, Rolf retrieved a shotgun. It was legally owned and kept in the home. In a moment that investigators would later describe as driven by emotion and loss of control, Rolf aimed and fired. 2 shots echoed through the quiet Espoo neighborhood. Both struck Jana. He collapsed, gravely wounded. But the violence didn't stop there. Evidence later showed that after firing, Rolf struck him multiple times on the head with a metal barrel of the gun. It was brutal, sudden, and shocking in its intensity. When the noise subsided, the home fell silent again. What had been a domestic disagreement minutes earlier had turned into a crime scene. Hours passed before the outside world realized what had happened. Friends became worried when Jana didn't respond to messages. One of them, concerned, decided to check on him. That friend arrived at the house and discovered a scene that no one could have imagined: Jana's lifeless body inside. The police were called immediately. Local authorities arrived at the residence, cordoned off the area, and began their investigation. Within a short time, Rolf Nordmo was taken into custody. The weapon was found in the home. He didn't resist arrest. The small Finnish neighborhood, known for its tranquility, became the center of national attention overnight. News of Jana Pahaka's death spread quickly across Finland and beyond. Sports organizations, former teammates, and fans expressed disbelief. He was young, talented, and respected, not just for his skill, but for his honesty and openness. The Finnish Hockey Association released a statement expressing sorrow and sympathy for his family. Social media filled with tributes and memories from people who had played with or known him. To many, it didn't make sense. How could a man who had overcome the challenges of professional sport and the stigma of coming out end up as a victim of domestic violence? As the police began their work, they classified the case initially as suspected manslaughter. However, the details that began to emerge from the investigation hinted at something darker and more deliberate. The nature of the attack, the 2 gunshots and the blows to the head, suggested rage rather than accident. Still, in those early days, much was unclear. The community waited for answers. Behind closed doors, investigators began interviewing neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. They gathered information about the couple's relationship, the timeline of their separation, and the events leading up to that morning. The picture that formed was of a relationship that had quietly deteriorated, a connection that had once provided comfort but had turned into resentment. For Finland, a country where violent crime is relatively rare, this case struck a nerve. It wasn't just about a killing. It was about love gone wrong, control, and the devastating consequences of emotional obsession. The image of Jana Pahaka, once a symbol of courage and authenticity, was now tied to an act of violence that left more questions than answers. As the first week of the investigation closed, authorities confirmed that Rolf Nordmo was under arrest and cooperating with police. He had spoken to investigators but remained calm and measured. The nation watched as the case unfolded, waiting to learn what could have driven a respected man to commit such an act. What began as a breakup had become a national tragedy. And though the evidence was beginning to tell its story, the full truth, why it happened, what Rolf intended, and how Jana's final moments unfolded, was still to come. In the days following the killing of Jana Pahaka, Espoo felt the weight of something that didn't belong to it. The quiet suburb, known more for university campuses and family homes than for violence, suddenly found itself under a glare of cameras and curiosity. Police tape surrounded the modest house the two men had shared. Neighbors walked by silently, glancing toward the home but avoiding conversation. Finland is a country where privacy runs deep, but this was different. People wanted to understand how something like this could happen in a place so ordinary, between two people who once loved each other. The investigation began immediately. Forensic teams spent hours inside the house, documenting every piece of evidence, photographing every surface, and collecting fibers, fingerprints, and traces of gunshot residue. The weapon, a legally owned shotgun, was found inside, its barrel bent slightly, a sign of the blows that followed the shooting. Blood patterns told a story of proximity and rage. Police could tell that Jana had been shot at close range, twice, before being struck on the head. The violence was not a single moment of panic. It unfolded over several seconds that must have felt endless. Outside the technical details, detectives needed to understand the human story behind the crime. Who were these men? What had gone wrong? Why had a relationship that appeared stable ended in murder? They began piecing together their histories. Two people from different worlds whose paths had crossed at the wrong time. Jana Pahaka's life had been about momentum. From his teenage years, he had lived on skates and buses, traveling from town to town for matches, building his career one goal at a time. He had played in the Finnish Liga, the top professional league, and even abroad in Norway and Switzerland. His teammates remembered him as disciplined and reserved but kind, the kind of player who didn't seek attention but earned respect naturally. When he came out publicly as gay, it wasn't a loud declaration. It was matter-of-fact, something he believed was necessary for honesty, not publicity. That choice made him the first Finnish pro hockey player to do so, and while it brought him praise, it also put pressure on him. After retiring from professional play, Jana had begun to redefine himself. He worked as a coach occasionally, did interviews, and spent more time with family and close friends. He seemed ready for a quieter life. That was around the time he met Rolf Nordmo. Rolf's life had taken a different shape. At 66, he was established in his career as a veterinarian, running a small practice and occasionally volunteering in animal rescue programs. Originally from Norway, he had settled in Finland decades earlier and built a modest, comfortable life. He was methodical, private, and proud of his independence. People who knew him described him as intelligent and gentle, but some hinted that he could be controlling in personal matters, someone who didn't adjust easily when things changed. The age difference between Rolf and Jana was significant, but at first it seemed to work for them. Jana found stability and care. Rolf found companionship and vitality. Friends recalled seeing them together at restaurants and social events, quiet but affectionate. Yet the dynamic shifted over time. When Jana began talking about moving on with his life, Rolf struggled to accept it. He had grown used to their routine, to the comfort of having someone young and admired beside him. For him, the breakup wasn't just emotional loss. It was a collapse of a life he had built in his final years. During police interviews, friends and acquaintances painted a picture of tension growing over the months before the murder. Jana had confided to a few close friends that Rolf had become increasingly possessive, that he would call or message often, asking where he was or who he was with. Nothing overtly violent had happened before, but the tone of their communication had changed. Jana had moved out in September, only a few weeks before the shooting. The separation was supposed to be temporary, just enough time to give both men space. He had planned to retrieve his remaining belongings once things calmed down. Investigators confirmed that Jana went to the house on the morning of October 13th to finalize those details. He wasn't expecting conflict. Text messages on his phone showed polite exchanges with Rolf about meeting to sort through property. There were no threats, no warnings. Forensic analysis of the home later revealed that there was no sign of forced entry or struggle before the gunfire. Jana had likely been standing or sitting when the first shot was fired. Rolf's account during questioning was calm but detached. He admitted to shooting Jana, though he insisted he hadn't planned it. He claimed the argument escalated quickly and that he lost control. He spoke of frustration, of feeling abandoned, of emotions he couldn't contain. Detectives noticed how composed he seemed, even when describing the violence. He didn't attempt to flee after the killing. Instead, he called a lawyer and waited for police. When they arrived, he surrendered without resistance. Forensic psychologists later assessed him, trying to determine his mental state at the time. They concluded he was fit to stand trial and fully aware of his actions. There was no evidence of psychosis or intoxication. What emerged instead was a picture of obsession and wounded pride, a man who couldn't accept the end of a relationship and lashed out in a moment of irreversible rage. Meanwhile, the shock of Jana's death rippled through Finland's hockey community. Players posted tributes online, remembering him as humble and brave. Sports journalists reflected on his significance not only as an athlete, but as a role model for LGBTQ visibility in sports. Candlelight vigils were held in his memory. His family, devastated, released a short statement asking for privacy and thanking supporters for their kindness. They described Jana as a loving son, brother, and friend who had touched lives beyond the rink. The investigation's findings became public gradually. Police confirmed that Rolf Nordmo had confessed, but refused to classify the act as premeditated murder. He described it as a moment of despair. Prosecutors, however, were not convinced. The close-range shots, the physical assault after the shooting, and his composure afterward all pointed to an intent that went beyond impulse. Still, under Finnish law, distinguishing between manslaughter and murder depends heavily on motive and deliberation. Reporters covering the case noted how unusual it was for a crime of passion like this to involve such age disparity and such a public figure. Domestic violence cases were not rare in Finland, but this one involved people who seemed far removed from typical stereotypes. Both were educated, financially secure, and socially respected. That made the story all the more haunting, proof that tragedy doesn't follow predictable patterns. As the case moved forward, authorities gathered every detail they could. They analyzed phone records, emails, and witness statements. They reconstructed the final hours of Jana's life, from the time he left his apartment to the moment he was found. Each piece of evidence reinforced the sense that this was not random or accidental. It was the climax of emotional tension that had been building for months. By early winter, the preliminary investigation was complete. Prosecutors were preparing charges, and the media was bracing for a trial that would draw international attention. Finland's justice system is efficient and quiet compared to others. Sensationalism is rare. But this case, because of who Jana Pahakka was and how brutal his end had been, could not escape the spotlight. As the new year approached, Rolf Nordmo remained in custody, awaiting trial. He showed little emotion during court appearances, answering questions briefly and avoiding eye contact with the press. Jana's family sat through hearings, their faces heavy with silence. The legal process would determine guilt, but no verdict could undo what had already been done. The story that began with affection had ended in violence, leaving behind only questions about love, control, and the fragile line between heartbreak and destruction. The truth of what had happened inside that quiet Espoo home was becoming clearer, but justice, and any sense of closure, was still ahead. The trial of Rolf Nordmo began months after the killing, held in the Western Uusimaa District Court in southern Finland. By then, the investigation had produced a complete timeline of the events leading to Jana Pahaka's death. The courtroom was small, calm, and clinical, like most in Finland, but the air inside carried a heavy silence. Friends, family, and members of the media filled the benches, waiting to hear the final account of how and why a respected veterinarian had killed a young former hockey player once seen as a symbol of courage and progress. Prosecutors opened by laying out the evidence. They described how Nordmo had used a 12-gauge shotgun to fire 2 close-range shots at Pahaka. The first struck his shoulder, the second his chest. When Jana fell, Nordmo continued the attack, striking him on the head several times with the gun's metal barrel. Medical examiners testified that either the second shot or the head injuries could have been fatal. There were no signs of a struggle, suggesting that Jana hadn't expected an assault and had little chance to defend himself. The prosecution emphasized these details to show that the killing wasn't a spontaneous act, but a deliberate one. They argued that the violence demonstrated anger, resentment, and a need for control, not panic. Nordmo had been aware of his actions, they said. He had retrieved the weapon from another room, loaded it, and fired at close range. Afterward, he didn't attempt to flee or call emergency services. Instead, he contacted his lawyer and waited. That calm behavior, prosecutors said, was evidence of intention, not confusion. The state sought a conviction for murder, which in Finland requires proof of both intent and exceptional cruelty. The defense presented a different story. Nordmo's lawyer acknowledged the killing, but framed it as a crime of passion. He claimed Rolf had not planned the shooting, that it happened in a moment of emotional collapse after an argument about their relationship. He said Nordmo had been consumed by feelings of rejection and loneliness, unable to control his actions. He pointed to his client's age 66 and lack of criminal history, describing him as a man who had lived a quiet, respectable life until one devastating lapse. He asked the court to consider the act as manslaughter rather than murder. When Rolf Nordmo took the stand, his demeanor was detached but controlled. He spoke clearly, almost too calmly, as he described what had happened. He admitted to firing the gun, admitting that Jana's decision to leave him had broken something inside him. He said he hadn't meant to kill him, only to stop him from leaving again. The courtroom remained still as he recounted those words. To many listening, it was chilling, an explanation that exposed not madness but possession. He also confessed to hitting Jana after the shooting, saying he was in shock. But he denied ever planning to harm him. Expert witnesses, including psychologists, testified about Nordmo's state of mind. Their assessments agreed that he was mentally competent and understood the consequences of his actions. He was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and there were no signs of psychosis. The crime, they concluded, stemmed from intense emotional dependence and loss of control, not mental illness. The proceedings lasted several weeks. Each testimony added a layer of understanding, yet none could soften the tragedy. For Jana's family, listening to the details was unbearable. They had already lost their son and brother. Now they were hearing the last moments of his life described in slow, forensic language. Still, they attended every session, sitting quietly behind the prosecution's table. When the trial concluded, the judges withdrew to deliberate. In Finland, serious cases like this are decided by a panel of professional judges, not a jury. Their verdict came on a gray afternoon, delivered in calm tones. The court found Rolf Nordmo guilty of murder. The judges ruled that his actions showed intent and that the brutality of the attack met the legal definition of exceptional cruelty. They acknowledged that while the killing may have been fueled by emotion, it was not impulsive to the degree required for manslaughter. The deliberate use of a firearm, the follow-up assault, and his composed behavior afterward all pointed to conscious intent. Nordmo was sentenced to life imprisonment, the most severe penalty available under Finnish law. He was also ordered to pay compensation to Jana Pahaka's family for emotional suffering and funeral expenses. The ruling noted that Nordmo's age would not excuse him from accountability, and that the crime had caused immeasurable harm. Outside the courthouse, there were no loud reactions. Finland does not often see public displays after verdicts. But online, tributes to Jana flooded in once more. Teammates and fans posted photos from his hockey days, recalling his kindness and courage. Sports organizations spoke about his legacy as a player who opened doors for others to be honest about who they are. His family released one final statement, short and restrained, as Finnish families often are. They thanked the court for its decision and said only that they hoped Jana could now rest in peace. As months passed, the case slowly faded from headlines, but its impact lingered. In interviews and articles, commentators reflected on what it revealed about relationships and emotional control, about how love can turn possessive when fear and pride take over. For those who knew Jana, the tragedy was not just about violence. It was about potential loss too soon. He had survived the pressures of professional sport, found the courage to live openly, and inspired others to do the same. His death became a painful reminder that strength on the ice can't always protect someone from what waits behind closed doors. In the end, the story of Jana Pahaka and Rolf Nordmo was not about celebrity or scandal. It was about two men, one young, one old, bound by affection that turned toxic. It was about control, heartbreak, and the terrible cost of letting despair overpower reason. The quiet city of Espoo moved on, but the echo of that October morning remained, a reminder of how easily love can turn into tragedy when empathy disappears and silence takes its place.